till I can't no more.
I got the horses in the back. Horse stock is attacked.
In the coming week, U.S. officials confront meat supply chain challenges in the pandemic. The Trump administration is due to start the presidential transition process 6 months before Election Day, and World Press Freedom Day is commemorated. It's April 30th, 2020, and time for The World Next Week. I'm Bob McMahon.
And I'm Jim Lindsay. Bob, I want to note for our listeners that you and I are practicing physical distancing and recording this podcast from our respective homes. And because of that, we apologize in advance for any audio issues and any unintended guest appearances by our family members. Bob, where I want to begin is with President Trump's signature this week on an executive order that directs the Department of Agriculture to ensure that America's meat, pork, and poultry producers continue operations to the maximum extent possible, despite the threats posed by the coronavirus pandemic. Now, the signing of this executive order comes after workers at some of the country's largest meat processing facilities have contracted COVID-19. Can you tell us sort of what's going on here, Bob, and what risks the country faces?
Sure, Jim. It's a response to an alarming, uptick in reports of workers going offline or being infected at a number of meatpacking plants. The last report I saw said at least 79 food processing and meatpacking plants had reported cases of COVID-19 disease. That's as of this week. And plants are having to close temporarily because of illness. There's absenteeism. Some are just closing so they can do what they call a deep cleansing and retrofitting so that they can set them up in different ways. And for those who aren't familiar with meatpacking plants, and there's not a lot of people, I think, who are closely familiar, these are usually close quarters where workers are basically taking body parts of an animal, say, cattle or whatever, and they're separating it and putting it together for distribution to different places, whether it's large cuts that are going to, say, restaurants and bigger distributors, or the smaller cuts that you typically see in a grocery store. Anyway, this industry is incredibly consolidated. There's something like 4 major companies that dominate like 75% of this industry. So when this type of thing starts happening, it has immediate knock-on effects. You had the head of Tyson Foods this past week warning that, quote, the food supply chain is breaking in the United States after a series of scares at Tyson Foods, which is the second largest processor of chicken, beef, and pork. So what President Trump did was his executive order classifies these meat processing plants as critical infrastructure. That means he can invoke the Defense Production Act in matters related to their operation and their production levels. Part of it also relates to contracts and others, but I think one thing that a number of analysts have seized on is it's not so much that the president is now going to take over sort of direct control and mandating commerce occur at meat processing plants despite the danger, but more so that states or other local authorities can't step in and shut them down out of hand, but that this power lies with the president. President Trump, I think at one of his press conferences, said there were some legal aspects that required him to move in this direction. And I think part of that is that the federal government is asserting its authority in this respect.
Now, Bob, this was pursuant to a law that goes back to World War II, which is the Defense Production Act, correct?
I believe that's correct, yes.
My understanding was the Defense Production Act was designed in situations where companies don't want to produce something. But here we face a different situation, which is companies may not be able to produce something because their workforce is sick. I mean, at a number of these meatpacking facilities, the number of workers who's gotten sick is quite high. So how do you make a meat packaging plant work when the workers themselves can't show up? Or if they're healthy, they're afraid to show up because they don't want to get sick. I would imagine that could raise all kinds of legal liability issues, workman's compensation issues, and the like.
Yeah, this order earlier in the week spurred a number of really strong responses, especially among labor forces, pointing out to just what you said, Jim, which is that putting them in harm's way is not the way to respond to a public health scare. But as I said, I think as people are starting to parse the order and seeing what it actually calls for, there's a little bit of soft pedaling in terms of what it's calling on. Even as you said, the Defense Production Act was supposed to be directed at compelling production for things seen as critical to U.S. security. There's also some confusion, frankly, because the order came within a day or two of some new guidelines distributed by the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention and the Occupational Safety and Health Administration that were guidelines for meat processing workers. They were advising companies on providing proper protective gear, taking employees' temperatures at intervals, spacing workers out at least 6 feet apart, which is the distance seen as the safe distance to help prevent spread of the virus. So I think a lot of people looking at this industry industry and at this order are going to be watching is to the extent to which there are some de facto changes that are going to be enacted that are going to make these workplaces actually safer, and not so much that people are going to be march stepped into these factories and made to work. But it remains to be seen. There's a great deal of uncertainty. It's a kind of a novel use of this DPA, the Defense Production Act. And I think part of it, though, it more broadly speaks to the administration's concern about this particular sector of the food supply chain, where there are some enormous companies that have major stakes in this industry and that have raised the alarm on it. The administration was responding to that. Americans, meat diets are sort of taken as an article of faith. And so disruptions to that are taken very seriously. I do think, according to a lot of the reporting, though, there are going to be some disruptions, at least temporarily, as a lot of these bigger plants are retrofitted, and you're going to start seeing prices go up for chicken, ground beef, whatever.
Well, I think people who are vegans or vegetarians are going to say that you can have a very healthy, very enjoyable, very tasty diet just eating plant-based foods. And I think that they're right on that score. One of the things you're seeing here, Bob, is another example of how we built the American economy to emphasize efficiency. And as meatpacking plants have closed down, that has had effects rippling all the way back to the farm. Many of these, let's say take hog producers, they're generating animals to go off to the slaughter lots every day, but if they can't actually be processed, that system backs up. And so you're seeing reports of thousands of pigs being slaughtered that are never going to be turned into meat. And then, of course, you have the ripple effect to what does that mean for farmers in terms of their ability to maintain a profit, to stay in the business and the like. And this is sort of, another manifestation that when our system breaks down, it's not resilient in many ways. We don't have the capacity, for example, to just keep adding pigs to feedlots and the like.
No, it's a great point on a number of fronts, Jim. And it will be very interesting to see whether, I think in so many areas, obviously we're learning through this crisis that business as usual might not be the norm for years to come. And it could be very interesting to see whether this requires changes to this consolidation of the meatpacking industry. But it's something I think that it's also a phenomenon for the just-in-time approach to the food supply chain that you were referencing as well. So I noted the chef Jose Andre, who's been really a dynamic force in responding to food needs with his World Central Kitchen organization. He tweeted out, or I think it was earlier today, photos side by side, one showing a giant mound of Idaho potatoes that were just being dumped as garbage, basically, because there was no way to deliver them to their normal markets. And then next to that, a photo of a giant traffic jam of cars waiting to get into a food bank in San Antonio. And this is ongoing. We're seeing a number of people losing their jobs, losing their livelihoods for the foreseeable future. And even when unemployment kicks in, you still have a large and growing needy population. And yet the way the food supply chain is built, it's not very flexible as of yet in terms of pivoting and getting the food that was normally going to the restaurants and other big facilities and the numerous, I would say, work centers that are no longer functioning, and pivoting to a way that they can then be distributed to food banks. Some are doing this, and you are seeing it, and people are putting in incredible work, but it's still hurting that. The only other point I would make, Jim, apropos your point, was that this tendency to consolidate in meatpacking in particular, and it's not just in the U.S., I think it's international, because we've seen this, the culling of herds, so to speak, happen in previous outbreaks of viruses, whether it's mad cow disease in Great Britain or in Asia with bird flus and so forth. And there's a great concern that a number of experts have about the bunching together of animals in close proximity, sort of genetically altered, so that there's less and less of a kind of firewall to prevent a viral outbreak, not just from animal to animal, but the concern is, as always, is from animal to human. Now, it wasn't a meat processing plant that is believed to be the cause of the coronavirus. It was believed to be bats in a so-called wet market in Wuhan. However, this concern remains that other pandemics could be down the road. And if you continue to put animals together in this fashion, you're sort of asking for another pandemic.
Big issue, Bob, and I think a lot of tragedies along the way, as we've learned in our discussions.
Indeed. Well, let's go to something cheerier, Jim, potentially, like, say, politics.
Well, I don't know about that, Bob.
It's certainly different. The Trump administration actually faces a statutory deadline this coming weekend. That means it has to start the presidential transition preparation process. So can you talk a little bit, Jim? This weekend is 6 months before November 3rd, I think, is Election Day.
Correct.
What is this administration or any other in this position supposed to do in this case?
Happy to, Bob. And the background for all of this is the fact that the United States is unique among democracies bureaucracies in that when its head of government changes, so do almost all the senior positions in government. If you recall, when Donald Trump succeeded Barack Obama, something like 4,000 Senate-confirmed positions came open. Now, again, those are just the positions that require Senate confirmation, like Secretary of Defense, not all of the positions that presidents can appoint without going to the Senate. Think, for example, National Security Advisor. Indeed, one of the reasons why so many American administrations get off to a rocky start is that they essentially spend their first year just trying to staff up their team. Now, in 2010, Congress passed something known as the Pre-Election Presidential Transition Act, which was designed to mitigate at least some of this problem. And one of the rationales for doing so was to sort of spare presidential candidates who were actually worried about how to handle day one from being accused of being presumptuous if they're actually discovered to be planning for day one. Now, this law requires the White House to set up a coordinating committee and to convene agency directors across the government 6 months before an election. And that committee is supposed to coordinate with the opposing party. Now, this is the first of a series of deadlines. The first one is, again, as you mentioned, this Sunday. Another major milestone will come in September. That's when the Biden campaign will be entitled to government funding and space near the White House. So they'll have the capacity to plan for having a smoother presidential transition. Now, I'll note that the fact that Congress has put this transition process in place doesn't mean it's going to go well. Now, the Trump transition went notoriously poorly back in 2017. That was partly because President Trump was superstitious about planning for the transition, and he often got upset when the issue came up. But a bigger problem was that immediately after the election, he tossed out all of the work that Governor Chris Christie had done in trying to map out what a transition would look like. So even though you have a process in place, doesn't mean it's going to go well. And indeed, this time around, one of the big concerns is how cooperative, how cordial our relation is going to be between this White House and the Biden campaign. That's a big question mark. I think it's safe to say there's some bad blood and suspicion out there. I'll note that last week, Joe Biden said at a fundraiser, let me quote him here, "Mark my words, I think he's referring to President Trump, is going to try to kick back the election somehow, come up with some rationale why it can't be held," end quote. Now, President Trump has responded that he, let me quote him here, never even thought of changing the election date, but that gives you some sense of the tenor and tone of relations between the two camps.
Yeah, and it follows on what ended up being a very partisan process or vote involving the president's impeachment this past year between Democrats and Republicans. The president has repeatedly taken to Twitter to ridicule various opponents throughout the Democratic primary process, and certainly Joe Biden's not been spared. There was some flurry of reporting within the last couple of days about the president reportedly being very angry at seeing recent polling showing Joe Biden doing much better than him in important swing states. So against the backdrop of this coronavirus, against concern about whether and debate about whether or not the election actually should be primarily done through the mail and not done in person, if there are concerns of a second wave and so forth. There's so many things that are now fraught surrounding this election, Jim, that it's like no other year, although we do go through this 6-month period that was envisioned as a period, as you said, of cordial exchange of information.
And I should note, for people who are wondering about Election Day, it is set in law when Election Day will be held, and the formal process of electing a president is sort of kicked off by Election Day. You have to have the Electoral College meet, you have to calculate its votes, Congress has to certify it. So there's not a lot of wiggle room for trying to change the date of a presidential election. Again, it's set by statute. I think the bigger question is going to come with how effectively can the election be carried out in the fall, particularly if we're still sort of in the current state or we've seen a second wave of the coronavirus. And this gets us back to the question of holding elections by mail. The president has been, I think, pretty vocal opponent of vote by mail, arguing that it's subject to fraud, and also confessing that he thinks if they were to have vote by mail, that Republican candidates won't fare well. But I'll also note that Democrats come back and say the United States military, members of the United States military, have been voting by mail for some time, and it's a perfectly acceptable way to do it. So we're going to see that battle be fought out. But that battle will mostly take place on the state level because, again, the United States has a federal system in electoral laws, things like rules governing who can go to the polls, when the polls are open, rules governing absentee ballots and the like are set on the state or the local level. So that's not something that Washington gets to determine.
I would add one more potentially intriguing subplot, which is the fate of the U.S. Postal Service in all of this. The service itself is dealing with a major debt problem, and its funding, potentially as part of some of the rescue bills being discussed right now, could come into serious question. So that's something else to watch in this whole thing.
Bob, I don't want to take us too far afield, but I think that's an important issue you just touched on. Could you just tell us a little bit more about why it is that we have the Postal Service, which is still operating during the pandemic? Mail's still coming, so those postal workers are putting themselves at risk. However, the White House doesn't want money to go to the Postal Service to keep it running.
Yeah, I mean, we're talking about one of the oldest, if not the oldest, federal service in the country, and it has had its problems with its funding shortfalls. I think there are others out there who know a lot more of it than I do, but my understanding is they were required by law several years back by Congress to fund their pension, and to do so, as anybody responsible for funding pensions in any employment, public or private, knows, that's a major outlay. So by requiring that at a time when the Postal Service was, it was struggling against some of the competition out there in the freight delivery world and so forth, it was finding itself more and more difficult straits in being able to upkeep. It was closing some of its offices, especially in the rural areas. And so it's been a department under stress, I think, for the last several years. It just recently announced, the head postal official announced that they were going to need to get $25 billion in the next couple of months, or they were going to be insolvent. And so the White House had problems with the Postal Service for a variety of reasons. The president has raised a number of problems, one of which is that he sees it as giving Amazon kind of a free ride or a cheap ride on allowing it to deliver its products really cheaply and maintain its what's seen as a outsized role monopoly in delivery of packages in this country. There's other issues at play here, Jim, but I think it's one of these issues where there is partisan disagreement about how much the Postal Service should be supported. I do think at the end of the day, I get the impression at the end of the day, I should say, that there will be some sort of compromise worked out and they will be able to fund the post office at least for a short period of time. But it just, as I said, it just adds another layer of intrigue to everything else that's playing out involving the vote.
Well, I do hope this issue gets resolved equitably, Bob. I simply will just say, I want to do a shout out to Sean, my letter carrier, and all the other people who work for the Postal Service who get the mail to me. So thank you.
Well said. Same on my end, too. I wish I knew the name of my carrier who's been every single day during this crisis has been out there faithfully delivering mail.
And I don't hold them responsible for bringing me junk mail and lots of bills, but I do appreciate the rest. Changing topics, Bob, this coming May the 3rd marks UNESCO's World Press Freedom Day. Each year, this day is an opportunity for people around the world to recognize and discuss the struggles and challenges that journalists face. The theme of this year's commemoration is journalism without fear or favor. Can you take us a little bit more into the significance of the day, Bob, especially since you began your life as a journalist, your professional life?
Certainly, Jim, and actually worked for a number of years for a U.S.-funded media known as Radio Free Europe, Radio Liberty. So the freedom of journalism was very much baked into that enterprise and still is. That's still a going concern. But yes, I think it's significant to note that this day was formally set up just a couple years after the collapse of the Soviet Union. It was 1993, I believe. And it was a time period when press freedoms and other freedoms were on the upsurge, shall we say. In the aftermath of the collapse of communism, you started to see more and more assertiveness for freedoms, especially freedom of the press. Very vibrant press has emerged in Eastern Europe, for example, and some of the former Soviet states, but not all. And so it was a time when the global appetite to commemorate this, even though there continued to be cynicism surrounding it in some authoritarian countries, still countries saw fit to mark it. There was a great deal of NGO work, and still is, by the way, in terms of supporting the work of journalists. There's outfits that people have heard of, like Committee to Protect Journalists and Reporters Without Borders, International Press Institute. All of them have oversight of helping to protect the craft of journalism and the actual work of journalists, which has gotten, unfortunately, exceedingly dangerous in the last, say, 2 decades or so. If you look at a graph of violence against journalists in prison, or journalists missing, it's sort of one of these graphs that just goes up and up and up over the last, say, 2 decades or so. Coincides, by the way, with sort of the post 9/11 world. And press freedoms, as other freedoms, go down, press freedoms tend to be the first in line as countries kind of turn in a dark direction. We mentioned this previously in an earlier podcast about early on in the coronavirus response, some countries were clamping down on press freedoms, Jim. So I think the day has special resonance this year. Like a lot of other these global events that were supposed to be marked in this time of lockdown, it's going to be a mostly online affair. But I do think some organizations in UNESCO itself has already postponed until the fall some in-person events to mark press freedoms. And so I think it is really important that the numbers and the names be raised of journalists who are facing threats. Washington Post has actually been running all all week. And I think up to World Press Freedom Day, they've been running a full page ad with a different single journalist featured every day who's been imprisoned or is facing repression in their country. And so it's a tough time. And some of these are countries that are U.S. allies or that are nominally democracies. And so I think it's an important moment to take stock of the importance of press. It's been a tough year for a variety of reasons. And you have in the coronavirus pandemic a truly difficult story to cover even in better times. And so economically, it's been tough for journalists. I think they're facing physical dangers. And you're seeing this antagonism play out even in the White House briefing room, president's briefings. It's a really challenging moment for world press, but I think it's a moment to reflect on why it matters and why people still, I think, take for granted they're going to get information. By and large, there's still a great deal of organizations providing accurate, thorough, and courageously reported information, even while there's a lot of noise and misinformation out there.
Bob, I want to pick up on two of the themes you just touched on. One is I don't think we can have this conversation without talking a bit more about President Trump's campaign against what he calls fake news. I want to be very clear here. I'm not contending that White House press pool reporters asking questions at 5 p.m. are equivalent in the challenges they face to a journalist in Iran who's been imprisoned. But the president has consistently come back and accused the press of fake news. And again, sort of, from your perception, your perspective as somebody who did actual journalism, how do you assess the consequences of the president's attack? Because when I talk to a lot of people who are Trump supporters, they like the president's criticism of the press. They think the press is rude and overbearing. What's the message you'd want to tell people like that?
What I want to tell them is that at the end of the day, truth is truth and facts are facts. And there needs to be, especially during a time of a public health crisis, the country needs to be able to agree, at the very least, on what facts are. Is a certain drug to be recommended to treat coronavirus, or is it dangerous? For example, to cite one example of an issue that was raised by the president himself when he was pressing for chloroquine as a potential cure for the coronavirus. That was later walked back by his own administration and health officials who said it is not, and the tests have shown it's not. But we're in this really difficult environment now, and it's made more challenging by, I think, the structure of those 5 o'clock press conferences that you called, Jim. You see reporters there who are trying to hold the president to account for past comments he's made on the virus. But also there's, I think, concern that some press might be grandstanding, that they might be trying to make a point and sort of make a little bit of a name for themselves. That's certainly something that's not been foreign to those types of briefings in the past.
And it's not particular to President Trump. I mean, my sense is that all presidents, if you ask them, they got plenty of questions they thought were inappropriate, unfriendly, hostile, or gotcha.
Right. At the end of the day, there's been a great deal of debate. I've been watching this closely within the media industry itself about whether or not those briefings should be covered, or if they are, if the press should be focusing on, what is really happening and what's the state of play of both the extent of the virus outbreak and the extent of activities that the government has been taking to try to deal with them. Some of that is coming through. Some of that is getting very much convoluted in the theater that goes on there. And the president has, it must be said, he's treated these events as an opportunity to present his grievances against the press, to present his broader grievances, but also to point to victories. There has been a problem with the way those events have been staged in terms of the public health experts are given not as much time to sort of make a case for something. Sometimes they are contradicted directly by the president. As I said, it's an incredibly challenging time to be covering this virus in any event because there's still so little known about it and the way it spreads and the way a lockdown could or could not remain effective over a period of time. On top of it all, there is a unique individual as President of the United States who has taken on this crisis as a personal affront in many ways, and his supporters have rallied behind him. Some have become disaffected and have turned against him, it must be said. And polls have shown that people have been more supportive of their governors and people at the local level who are holding briefings. And many people point to Governor Cuomo in New York, the governor of Ohio, Mike DeWine, has been also gotten a lot of praise. He's Republican. And Larry Hogan of Maryland, another Republican, and see them as more stewards, say, of sort of straight reporting. What does that mean for the press? The press should be trying to provide context and information and not sort of get caught up in the spin so much. It's very difficult in this environment right now to do that. There's going to be reams and reams published about this moment. And I think just for the press alone, Jim, and to the extent they can get out of the way and try to report on what's happening, and they are, by the way, in many instances, the better off will be. I must also note, as someone who was able to access a lot of information, a lot lot of the big media, Washington Post and New York Times, Wall Street Journal, I think the reporting has been superb. If people are able to read those on a regular basis, in addition to whatever their other favorite sources of entertainment and infotainment are, I think they have a straight sense of what's going on.
Bob, the other question I just wanted to get a quick reaction from you on is your reference to the difficult economics facing the news business right now. If anything, you're putting that quite gently. My sense is that a lot of media outlets, particularly local news sources, even big city news sources, newspapers, are under tremendous financial pressure. On my Twitter feed, I keep seeing more and more journalists announcing to the world that after 10, 15, 20, 35 years working for a news outlet, they're now unemployed. Do you think that the news media is going to be able to survive the pandemic? And is it really healthy that you have a few media outlets, think the New York Times, Washington Post, Wall Street Journal, which are doing well, while lots of other media entities probably are headed to the ash heap of history?
It's one of the most troubling aspects of the economic impact of this, Jim, has been the decline of media. And we're talking about big newspapers, but also community newspapers. It's been devastating for the so-called community press in the United States, but I've also seen reports from Canada, Australia, other places around the world. When those media die, and they tend to be smaller papers that people have taken on as passion projects, when they go away, it's very hard to replace them. And if it is a replacement, it tends to be digital. There tend to be less efficient ways of distributing that news. And sometimes you have these neighborhood listservs that come up, and sometimes they're spreading information, and sometimes they're spreading rumor and gossip and so forth. It poses a really tough problem, I think. I think one of the reasons why press freedoms have been enshrined in democracies like the United States and why they've been recognized by UNESCO is they're seen as the underpinnings of healthy societies. I mean, I remember coming of age when I was getting into the business, it was the lament at the time was the decline of the cities that had two newspapers. It was always, every major U.S. city was known for having at least two major papers always competing against each other. And that was seen as healthy because they were driving competition to get stories and basically shedding light on what was going on and covering local government, covering city government, covering state government really efficiently. In many of those cases, one paper emerged stronger. And then those papers now are shells and they're not covering issues as much as possible. So it's going to be very interesting to see whether or not some of the big tech companies that have benefited from information flows, whether it's Facebook or Apple or Google, whether they come in, they've been providing grants, increasing number of grants to try to support media, whether they take it to another level, because at the end of the day, it's one of the things that's fed their audience bases and their subscribers. So we'll have to see, Jim, but it's very dismal development on that front.
Yeah, it's dismal, Bob, and I don't think it's going to get better. And I think that's deeply troubling for the future of American democracy. As good as the New York Times or Washington Post or Wall Street Journal may be, they're not going to be providing the kind of news coverage that you would have gotten in days past by city-based newspapers. And indeed, I think in the media, like anything else, competition is a healthy thing. And this sort of movement online where what matters is getting clicks tends to distort what journalism does.
Well said. Well, we've been throwing around a lot of figures, Jim. That reminds me, it's the time for our figure of the week. So who or what is your figure?
Bob, I'm going with a number this week, and my number is 18, as in 18 days. That is the number of days since North Korean leader Kim Jong-un was last seen in public. Now, I know I discussed this in last week's podcast, but I wanted to return to it because it's a mystery and I like mysteries.
This could be a serial feature, Jim. It could be Where is Kim? It could pop up every week for us.
I expect that to be the case. And I will note there are three hypotheses. One is that he is dead, one that he is in a coma, and another that he is alive but hiding. We haven't seen any new information come forward. President Trump said earlier this week that he had, let me quote him here, a very good idea, end quote, of Mr. Kim's health status, and said the rest of us would learn about it in the, again, I'm quoting, in the not too distant future. But just yesterday, Secretary of State Mike Pompeo said, we haven't seen him. We don't have any information to report today, but we're watching it closely. And again, this is just touched off a lot of speculation. Again, same as reported last week, the South Korean government saying he's fine. We haven't seen anything indicate anything is unwell. A lot of stories about his having surgery that didn't go well. And then there's been some speculation that the coronavirus has penetrated North Korea and Mr. Kim is deathly afraid for his health status. So he's just gone incommunicado, sort of taking physical distancing to the ultimate to keep himself safe. We don't know. We'll see what's going to happen. But what I thought was really interesting in Mike Pompeo's comments yesterday was this sort of a side reference to the fact that he thinks there's a real risk that there's going to be a famine inside North Korea. So the situation in North Korea may be taking a turn from the worse, and it began in a bad spot in the first place.
North Korean watchers have been reporting, the hoarding of what supplies there are available in a typical North Korean store are vanishing rather quickly. And there's a great deal of speculation within North Korea. There have also been sightings of the train that Kim usually travels in near a resort. So that's given rise to the one theory that you mentioned, that he's just hiding out and trying to keep himself away from the virus. It's still not clear the extent to which the virus has hit North Korea or not. Potentially it has dodged it. Potentially South Korea's own effective measures at keeping it suppressed have helped it from leaping the border, although the most open border that the North Koreans have is with China. So we'll have to see on that front. But I thought it's also interesting, Jim, the speculation about succession, given that it seems like a porous area right now. The most capable, quote unquote, successor seen as his sister, but there seems to be no provision for a woman taking over.
Yes, North Korea does not come across as a place that would warmly welcome a woman as their leader. However, the Kim family has abided by this notion of the official Mount Paektu bloodline successor. Mount Paektu is the tallest mountain in North Korea. It's up on the border with China, and it is where the founder of the Kim dynasty was based as he launched his campaign to attack and harass Japanese soldiers during World War II. Again, we may be faced with a succession crisis in North Korea, or perhaps by the time this podcast is posted, we're going to get video of him meeting with other North Koreans or some dignitary. We will see. Again, still a story to keep an eye on. But Bob, who or what is your figure of the week?
Jim, my figure is a person, and it is the actor Irfan Khan, who died this past week at the age of 53. Now, his name may not ring a bell to some, but he was a familiar figure in high-profile movies such as Slumdog Millionaire and The Life of Pi. He was also in the recent blockbuster sequel Jurassic World. And as an Indian Muslim, he was among the few to achieve success in both Bollywood and Hollywood. He was still making movies in Bollywood, Hindi language movies in Bollywood, but was becoming increasingly recognizable for his roles in major Western released movies as well. And I think it was interesting. What struck me is I became aware of him from a movie called The Namesake. This came out about 15 years ago or so. I always found him a very compelling actor to watch. He brought a really deep humanity to his roles and a real believability. He was in these epic sprawling movies. Even in a movie like Jurassic World, he's a very interesting actor to watch. And again, like when we talked about Kobe Bryant after he died as this global figure, it become this incredibly well-known brand ambassador for the U.S. I think Khan in his own way was for India in terms of an export of the Indian film industry, and someone who would become increasingly known because these movies now in the globalized world were being seen everywhere. And because he was being approached for bigger and bigger movies, I think certainly his marketability was seen. But he's very much beloved in India too. And I just wanted to note that as here is yet another sort of transcendent media figure that the world lost this week.
Very sorry to hear that. And he was in some great movies and left behind a pretty impressive legacy.
Absolutely. I do recommend people to take a look at Life of Pi for a true escapist fare during these lockdown days. And that was our look at the world next week. Here's some other stories to keep an eye on. The holiday Cinco de Mayo is celebrated, and Pulitzer Prizes are announced via live stream in the U.S.
Please subscribe to The World Next Week on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts, and leave us a review while you're at it. They help us get noticed and improve the show. Please note that opinions expressed in The World Next Week are solely those of the host or our guests, not of CFR, which takes no institutional positions on matters of policy. Today's program was produced by Zoe Collis with senior producer Jeremy Shirley. Special thanks go to Anu Kumar, Claire McGraw, and Anna Shortridge for their assistance. This week, our recording engineer was Zoe Collis. Thank you, Zoe. Our theme music is provided by Miguel Herrero and licensed under Creative Commons. This is Jim Lindsay saying goodbye.
And this is Bob McMahon saying so long and be safe out there.